son is the best son in the world. He's a very normal, active boy. Yeah, did all the things that most boys like to do.
When you shake hands and greet a new neighborly countenance, what is the first thing that crosses your mind? Do you welcome the pleasantries and accept them for what they are? Or are you more timid, wondering what might lie behind that friendly facade? This was the question posed at the core of the circumstance surrounding the crimes of Ted Bundy. Surely this forthcoming, charismatic family man wasn't a nightmare in sheep's clothing, right?
I don't go out anymore. I'm in this house 24 hours a day. It's like dying. Think of how things were before Ted Bundy came into our lives. Nothing's the same anymore.
On November 24th, 1946, Theodore Robert Cowell was welcomed into the home of his parents, Samuel and Eleanor, with his significantly older sisters, Louise and Julia, in Roxborough, Pennsylvania. Samuel was known outwardly as a very neighborly presence, outgoing and thoughtful to those around him, but behind closed doors, he exhibited a much darker and more aggressive persona. Discriminatory, xenophobic, single-minded, he kept his family on a straight arrow of expectation and punished any deviation with an iron fist. On one occasion, he threw his younger sister Julia down the stairs for sleeping in just a little bit too long for his liking. Despite this, young Theodore clung to the man over everybody else in the household. Perhaps it was this masochism and misogyny he was exposed to that explained the peculiar behaviors he began to exhibit as he grew older. At the age of 3, his sister, Julia, woke up from a nap only to find herself surrounded in bed by a collection of knives from the kitchen, young Teddy smiling deviously at the foot of the mattress. He was known as a bully throughout his neighborhood as well, constantly found harassing animals and children alike. Of course, this was another activity learned from Samuel, who had been known to grab cats that dared trespass in his yard and swing them by the tails, laughing hysterically. Louise, 26 at the time, realized that this environment was far too volatile for a 4-year-old, and in 1950 she fled the home with him to go live with her cousins in Tacoma, Washington. She changed her last name to Nelson in an effort to distance herself from her family, and did her best to make the boy comfortable in this stable, new environment. However, he was greatly distressed by the loss of his male role model, and remained sheepish and distant from the rest of his family. A year later, Louise met a man by the name of Johnny Bundy, and before long they were married. In an effort to include young Teddy and make him feel more welcome, Johnny adopted the boy, and he quickly got used to the name everyone started calling him, Ted Bundy. One thing he never got used to was the man he was now forced to call father. It didn't matter how many siblings he brought into the world for him, or how many vacations they took together, he remained cold to this imposter all throughout his youth. The mark Samuel had left on him was all too evident, and his troublesome attitudes pervaded his youth. As a teenager, he took to the habit of sneaking out at night and peering through the open windows of his neighbors, spying on women at their most exposed. This voyeuristic practice came to replace his childish bullying phase as he attempted to give off a more outwardly pleasant presence during high school. In fact, he was known to be quite popular, even if his juvenile record wasn't quite copacetic. On multiple occasions, Bundy was arrested on these late-night outings, suspected of burglary attempts on various homes. He was also proven to have forged tickets at various ski lodges and stolen skiing equipment to participate in the activity. All of these offenses were expunged from his records when he turned 18, and when he graduated in 1965, he continued his educational pursuits at the University of Washington, studying Chinese. He found himself dating a woman by the name of Diane Edwards, and, at least for a while, it seemed as though he had outgrown his delinquent behavior. Bundy was completely smitten with her, believing her to be everything he ever wanted in a woman. She was kind, smart, funny, forward-thinking. By 1968, Bundy had dropped out of college and Diane had graduated, and they both moved to California to be close to her family. This was short-lived, however, because Diane was quickly growing frustrated with Bundy's lack of ambition, and in August she broke up with the man. Instead of moving back to Colorado to live with Louise and her husband, he moved back to Pennsylvania in an effort to reconnect with his parents. The breakup had come as a complete surprise to the young man, and he felt he needed the support of the people he had been whisked away from as a child in order to cope. When he arrived at their doorstep, they were both surprised and overjoyed to see him. But he could see something was eating at them as he spent day after day calling them mom and dad. Eleanor was growing ill in her older age and didn't want to leave things unattended if she were to pass on. She needed to tell Ted the truth. They weren't his parents, but his grandparents. Louise was not his sister, she was his mother. His entire family had been lying to him for 23 years. The revelation turned his entire world upside down.
Ted Bundy was brought up on the assumption that his grandparents are his parents and his mother is his sister. He's sort of brought into this world or web of lies and starts forming, his personality based on this family dynamic that is really an unhealthy dynamic.
Nobody really was who they said they were. Bundy knew this. If there was anything he knew for certain, anything his life had taught him at all, it was this fact. If he couldn't even trust his own family to give him straightforward facts about the basic realities of his life, what tethers did he really have to an objective truth? He knew he couldn't trust anyone else but himself to find the answers he sought. Shortly after this bombshell, he returned to Washington State and re-enrolled in university, this time majoring in psychology. He was going to dissect the inner workings of a human being. During his studies, he started dating another woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, a secretary at UW School of Medicine. She had a 3-year-old daughter named Molly, and she quickly took to Ted as a new father figure. Their life together seemed perfect, white picket fence and everything. And as the years went by, Teddy was even hired as a suicide hotline operator and as an assistant to the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, all while taking law classes to expand on his psychology degree. He was required to fly around the US for work, and one of these trips rekindled a spark that lay long dormant, something that would change the face of crime forever.
Came across as brilliant, charismatic, smart. So you put together the evil with all of those positive traits, and you have a very dangerous person.
While on a trip to California in the summer of 1973, Ted became reacquainted with Diane Edwards. More than acquainted, actually. Behind Elizabeth's back, he started dating the woman again, but his intentions were more devious than either of his flames might have imagined. She knew he was a traveling businessman, but they always found a way to make it work. He would fly to her, she would fly to him. They would discuss their future, even marriage. At one point, Bundy even introduced her to his boss, claiming that she was his fiancée. This continued for over 6 months, until one day, the rendezvous stopped being planned. The calls stopped coming. The letters stopped appearing. It took Diane nearly a month to finally get in contact with Ted, and when she asked for an explanation, there was no indignation in his voice, no frustration, no sadness. He replied simply with, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and the line disconnected. Shortly after this, on January 4th, 1974, a young woman from UW was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. Her name was Karen Sparks, and when she finally came to 10 days later, she told police that a man had broken into her apartment late at night and attacked her with a metal rod from her bed frame. She was never able to identify the man. Her injuries were so extensive that she was left permanently disabled and unable to have children.
I was permanently brain damaged, and he'd say, that's a desk or a chair, can you say those words? And I just couldn't get them out of my mouth.
Her attack kicked off a series that saw at least one woman disappear per month from universities around Washington. On February 1st, 1974, another UW student by the name of Linda Ann Healy was abducted from her home and never seen again. March 12th, a student from another campus 60 miles away disappeared without a trace. Her name was Donna Gail Mason. April 17th, yet another student named Susan Elaine Rancourt vanished unexpectedly. When police investigated this disappearance, 2 witnesses came forward and described a suspicious man who had been in the area just days before, spotted on 2 separate nights, asking for help loading books into his tan Volkswagen Beetle. His arm was in a sling, and he was having clear trouble moving each stack, almost as if he wanted to be noticed. Over the following year, stories of the man in the Volkswagen Beetle began to crop up in not only Washington, but Oregon and Utah. The man always seemed to be wounded, wearing a sling or on crutches and in casts, and always seemed to be in need of help. But just as soon as his arrival was announced by witnesses, he would disappear and pop up somewhere else, just as disappearances started to be investigated. Even more disturbing, the disappearances were becoming more frequent, where once a month may have passed between abductions now became weeks or even days. On July 14, 1974, a series of broad daylight abductions occurred at the Lake Sammamish State Park, where nearly a dozen witnesses came forward to describe a clean-cut man in a sling named Ted in a tan Volkswagen Beetle, asking for help to unload his sailboat. One woman who chose to assist him, Janice Graham, realized after a time that there was no sailboat and darted from the vehicle. Her and her friends all gave enough descriptive information for police to release a composite sketch. Broadcast over the news, nearly everyone in the state of Washington and Oregon now knew the face of the man they had learned to fear. Some of them even knew the man personally and came forward with their own suspicions. A co-worker of Bundy's recognized his face and his car, as well as a professor from UW. With hundreds of tips coming in a day, authorities shrugged off the idea that a successful student and career-oriented political player was committing these crimes. But it was someone even closer to him that drove police to finally take these claims seriously.
Co-workers showed her a sketch of a murder suspect they thought resembled her boyfriend.
There was just something about the jawline or something like that that made me think, wow, this is really weird.
Did you think he was capable of murder?
On October 2nd, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox vanished unexpectedly in a suburb of Salt Lake City, Utah, triggering a new string of murders. Her body was found 9 days later, and investigation concluded that she had been kept alive for nearly a week following her disappearance. Just a week after she was found, on October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith was snatched after leaving a pizza parlor. Again, on Halloween, 17-year-old Laura Ann Aim. Oddly, despite their vicious wounds, these bodies would be found with their hair brushed free of knots and makeup applied to their battered faces. On November 8th, a woman by the name of Carol Duranch was walking outside of Fashion Place Mall when she was approached by a man who called himself Officer Roseland. He claimed that her car had been subject to an attempted break-in, and he needed her to come down to the station to identify the man they had in custody. Once she was in the car, and once she realized that they had driven past the police station, he held a gun to her and attempted to cuff both her hands. But in the struggle, he was only able to cuff one as she opened the door to the Volkswagen and bolted. After this point, he turned his attention to neighboring Colorado, knowing that somebody again had his face burned into their minds. When reports came in of these new deaths, Bundy's longtime girlfriend Elizabeth promptly called police from both jurisdictions, Washington and Utah, to report her suspicions for what would be a third time. She had been among the few who positively ID'd Bundy in the time after the Lake Sammamish abductions, which left 2 women dead. When police arrived to interview her, she revealed to them that he had been in Salt Lake City since August, when he moved there after being accepted into the University of Utah's law program. She also stated that he had often borrowed her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, to go on business, and often found strange objects within it after he returned, such as crutches, a bag of medical plaster, and a lug wrench that had been taped at the base as a makeshift grip. Bundy quickly rose to the top of the suspect list in both states, and when reports started coming in of even more murders in both Colorado and Idaho, including a traffic stop that revealed many of the items Elizabeth claimed to have found in her own vehicle, officers placed the man on 24-hour surveillance. Ted sold his car shortly after, but police impounded it and searched for evidence, positively tying him to the abduction of Duranch through hair fiber samples in the back seat. After over 6 months of joint investigation across all jurisdictions, he was sentenced in June of 1976 to 1 to 15 years for this crime and this crime alone, as no other evidence positively linked him to any other felony offense. While in prison, he maintained his innocence and even used his knowledge of the law to represent himself in the courtroom. Nobody wanted to believe that this straightforward and well-spoken man was capable of such vile actions.
I don't like being locked up for something I didn't do.
In January of 1977, Bundy was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, following a charge for the murder of 23-year-old nurse Karen Eileen Campbell 2 years earlier. For another 6 months, he spent his time in prison pouring through multiple law writings in an effort to form a defense. However, on June 7, 1977, he was brought to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for his first hearing, and acting as his own attorney, was granted access to the courthouse's library before the trial began. While researching his case, behind a bookcase and out of view from the guard supervising him, he opened a window and jumped from the second story to the ground below.
Good evening. Convicted Utah kidnapper Theodore Bundy has escaped from an Aspen, Colorado courtroom and remains at this hour the subject of a manhunt.
His leg injured from the fall, he limped into the mountains and spent 6 days at large, stealing food and clothing from nearby cabins before stealing a vehicle and trying to drive out of Aspen past multiple police roadblocks.
Radically, about an eighth of a mile east of Aspen on Highway 82, we observed this vehicle for a matter of seconds, and I turned around and pursued it, contacted it, and found Mr. Bundy driving it.
On June 13th, he was caught driving erratically through the city as he tried to avoid police vehicles and was placed back in prison. This did nothing to dissuade him though, and over the next few months he acquired intimate knowledge of the prison's floor plan through fellow inmates and bribed his way into getting a hacksaw, which he used to cut a hole into his ceiling in early December. Over the following weeks, he went on a series of practice runs in the late night hours, and multiple reports of movement within the ceiling went uninvestigated. On December 30th, Bundy enacted his second prison escape while most of the staff were away with their families for Christmas, breaking through the ceiling to the second-floor apartment of the chief jailer and stealing his clothes before walking out the front door of the prison. It took 17 hours for staff to realize that Bundy was no longer in his cell, and by then, he was well on his way to the farthest state he could fathom fleeing to, Florida. His furious frenzy was far from finished.
The killer came in from the night and then returned to it with an ease that has so far baffled police and left most co-eds here terrified.
Not 2 weeks after his escape, in the early morning hours of January 15th, 1978, Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house of Florida State University and within a span of 15 minutes, brutally attacked 4 women in their sleep. 21-year-old Margaret Bowman was assaulted first. Her life ended with a heavy oak log that crushed her skull. Bundy, immediately after, entered the room of her neighbor and viciously attacked 20-year-old Lisa Levy. During the attack, he bit her body in multiple places, so deeply that when investigators first arrived, they thought she had been shot. The battering was so severe that she was left with many internal organs ruptured, but he didn't stop there. Entering the adjoining bedroom, he brutally assailed Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner before he was startled by a set of headlights coming in through the window. As he fled, he was spotted by another sorority sister who was later able to give a positive description of the man. Police arrived shortly after and tended to the wounded. Bowman and Levy unfortunately succumbed to their wounds, but Kleiner and Chandler, thankfully, survived. While the investigation commenced within the walls of Chi Omega, a 911 call would pull police attention to another location just down the road. Roommates of another student, Cheryl Thomas, called police after they heard a commotion in her basement bedroom and found her severely injured, a makeshift mask on the bed next to her. All the appropriate evidence was collected from both crime scenes, and as police compiled a profile, Bundy sat in wait at his boarding home just 2 blocks down the road, rented under the alias Chris Hagen. On February 12th, unable to pay his rent due to a lack of income, Ted stole an FSU vehicle off the campus and fled north, then west, before being stopped 3 days later in Pensacola, after the vehicle had been verified to be stolen. When he was just about to be placed in cuffs, he kicked the officer's feet out from under him and started to run. The officer fired 2 warning shots over his head before giving chase and tackling him to the ground.
Police arrested this 31-year-old man after a high-speed chase Wednesday morning in Pensacola, Florida.
As he was led back to the vehicle, he looked directly into his captor's eyes and said, "I wish you had killed me."
Said killing was perpetrated by said Theodore Robert Bundy from or with a premeditated design or intent to effect the death of said Lisa Levy.
My chance to talk to the press.
Contrary to section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty right now.
And your grand jury...
Following another 6-month prison stint, Ted Bundy was indicted on July 28, 1978 for the murders of both Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, but also in the murder of a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Diane Leach, who he had slain during his exodus through Lake City into the Florida Panhandle. The only evidence they could find tying him to the crime were hair fibers collected from the face mask he left on the bed of Cheryl Thomas. And due to this, Bundy was incredibly arrogant and dismissive in the face of the plea deal offered to him. He knew for a fact that this wouldn't be enough to charge him with the 3 murders levied against him, but quick thinking from Jacksonville Sheriff Ken Katsaris provided prosecutors with the evidence necessary to place him at the scene of the crime. He ordered a search warrant, not for his vehicle, not for his apartment, not for any of his belongings, but for his mouth. He ordered a mold be made of Bundy's teeth so that they could cross-check his dental arrangement with the bite marks found on Levy. The proof was absolutely indisputable, and on July 24, 1979, he was sentenced to death for the murders. In the 10 years between his sentencing and ultimate demise, he spoon-fed confession after confession to investigators while trying to scapegoat his behavior on various aspects of his past, like his confusing upbringing, his obsession with detective stories, and even his pornography addiction. Over time, however, when he realized this method did nothing to stave off his death sentence, he relented and began to speak more plainly to investigators. He confessed to over 30 murders around the Pacific Northwest, one of which he even admitted to just hours before he was strapped into the electric chair on January 24, 1989. A group of excited citizens sat in wait outside of the prison walls, eagerly spying down the white hearse that now carried this monster's body.
Right here.
Ted Bundy was a predator, and his actions, as iconically stated by his sentencing judge, were extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile. His outward appearance challenged the previous status quo, where murderers of his caliber were often loners, scorned, antisocial cretins, lashing out at the disenfranchised. He used his innate understanding of human behavior and his degrees in both psychology and law to systematically enact his darkest desires with no fear of repercussion.